Welcome back. We're getting ready to start section 4, component 4, depending on how you want to look at it in chapter 8. And we're going to actually talk about aggregate demand, aggregate supply, how they move, what the long run is, what the short run is, and try to start to pull some of these concepts, trying to tighten them up, trying to get them to a point that hopefully somewhere along the way, the light bulb goes on and said, oh my God, now I know what you're talking about. If you remember in the individual markets, and I guess it was Adam Smith that brought forth the concept of the invisible hand, that there was something, some unknown source that managed supply and demand in the individual market and actually move it to equilibrium. And that to some extent happens in individual markets, that their prices and quantities there, eventually the markets will adjust and move everything to equilibrium. It's not exactly that way when it comes to aggregate demand and aggregate supply. And when you look at it, there's the potential when you're looking at the aggregate demand that slopes down, aggregate supply, we're going to find out is almost vertical. At least in the long run, it's almost vertical. In the short run, it can be sloping upward, but in the long run, it's almost vertical. And what you'll find is economists talk about long run and short run. Okay, what is long run? What's short run? Short run a week, a day, a month. Long run, 6 months, 9 months, a year. And the way it's typically, at least in the concept of macroeconomics, they talk about the short run is when wages and prices are slow to respond, and they talk about them being sticky. And we will actually get into this a little later in another section, but they're slow to respond to changes in economic conditions. So if you think about changes in consumer expectation, changes in tax rates, changes in wealth, changes in economy, they're just changes in government purchasing, investments, net exports. They're just slow to move to those changes in economic conditions. And think about what happened in COVID. Things were really slow to change in COVID. I mean, COVID was such a mess. They talk about the Great Recession of 2007, 2008. Things were slow and, really slow to respond and to move and to get everything back in, to the kind of the normal order of the economy. And, it basically, when they're, when sticky wages, sticky prices exist, what you have is an economy that's not at the natural level of employment. It's not at the natural level of, potential output. So we're not in the economy producing at that level that we could. And, you compare that in the macroeconomic, perspective or view with the long run. And in the long run, basically, it says wages and prices are extremely flexible. Markets will adjust to economic changes and conditions, drive things back to equilibrium in a reasonably short time, but it just does not move that way, even though the natural level of employment would get to kind of full level of employment, and you would end up with the real GDP getting back to its potential level. And it'd be great if that's the way it worked in the long run, but it just doesn't. There's an intermediate step. And the way that macroeconomics explains this intermediate step going from equilibrium and their changes in economic conditions, and how do we get aggregate demand, aggregate supply back to another equilibrium, that's where the long run aggregate supply curve comes into play. And that's where it's actually, I guess, beneficial to the macroeconomic discussion. And, what we just don't have time to fully adjust. So you've got your factors of production, labor, capital, goods and services produced, inputs and outputs, and everything's moving in different directions. And it just takes time for everything to adjust to these and I don't even say disruptions, changes in economic conditions. In the long run, again, the natural level of employment equals the real wage rate. And if you remember when we were talking about unemployment, we had omega, which was the real wage rate, and that's the nominal wage rate divided by the price level. So that gets you to omega, that equates to the natural level of employment. And it adjusts to eliminate cyclical employment. Remember, when we're talking about the unemployment rate, it's frictional plus structural. It doesn't have the cyclical embedded in there. But what happens is the market tries to adjust by setting the natural level of employment to the real wage rate, and that adjusts in such a way to eliminate that cyclical employment. Remember, cyclical employment, you find it in the business cycle. You've got some expansion, it hits a peak, it starts down into the recession, it hits a trough, it comes back up to expansion, hits a peak. There's your business cycle, peak to peak, business cycle. And what you have is that cyclical employment that happens as it goes from the peak. It starts down on the business cycle, it starts down into the kind of to the recession part of it, and that's where we end up in that cyclical unemployment. And then flexible wages and prices, market forces, it'll move the economy to the natural level of employment and to the potential real GDP. So that's where we're trying to get in the long run, and that's where we're having problems in the short run, because prices and wages are somewhat sticky and they're just slow to move and slow to respond. If you want to look at the long run average supply, it's a graphical representation that relates to the level of output produced by firms to the price level in the long run. And as I said, it's almost perpendicular. It's where the natural rate of unemployment, it's also equals the potential output, doesn't depend on prices. Your long run aggregate supply doesn't depend on prices. It depends on the level of output is determined by the factors of production and technology. What did we talk about earlier in this, not so much this session, but early in some of the earlier chapters, we talked about factors of production. You've got the labor market, you've got capital stock, you've got natural resources, which land falls in the natural resources. You've got oil and gas prices, and then you've also got, there's your big three, and then you've got technology and entrepreneurship, where technology is the technology of the production process, how efficient that production process is. And then you've got the entrepreneurs sitting out there, and entrepreneurs, as we said, are driven by profits, but they're out there trying to determine, how can I improve processes? How can I improve, the output that's produced? And again, driven by profit. You've got the entrepreneurs working within the realm of that technical experience and the processes that are turning inputs into outputs. And as I said, you've got price level on the vertical, you've got real GDP on the horizontal, you've got the long run average supply curve almost vertical there. It's vertical at the potential level of output, and that's kind of the classical viewpoint of it. So real GDP is also sitting there at full employment output, and that's at that point set equal to the potential real GDP. And resource prices adjust to changes in the price level. There's no incentive for producers to change their output. Again, remember, in the aggregate, we're talking about buyers and sellers. We're talking about expenditures and incomes. We're talking about prices the price level themselves So there's not much relative change among the prices. All the price levels themselves are moving in one direction or the other. Then as we've talked about, or as I've said earlier, this long run aggregate supply curve is vertical because it's not related to the price level. It's related to the quantity and the quality of the country's resources. And that's a key fact, because in some of the individual markets, prices were impacting not only the demand, but the supply in those individual markets. But now it's not. The price level is not impacting it. That the long run average supply curve is driven by the quantity and the quality of a nation's resources. And then secondarily, it's driven by how resources are combined, inputs to drive outputs, how they're combined in that production process. And that's where technology and entrepreneurship come into play. The link between inputs and outputs in any production process, as we've talked about earlier, it's the technology that brings those inputs and outputs together and efficiently combines them to generate a certain output level. And then the authors go on to say that full employment and the economy operating at its potential price level, that's where it reaches equilibrium with the aggregate demand and the aggregate supply curve in equilibrium. And that's the point that we're trying to get to in the long run. It's that intersection, and changes of demand, changes in the aggregate demand are fully reflected in the price level. And changes in aggregate supply are being driven by, again, the quantity and quality of the resources in any given nation's economy. In the short run, and here's where it starts to get, I don't want to say complicated, but it starts to get a little interesting. And when we're talking about, again, the short run and the long run, what's the differentiator? The true differentiator is the stickiness and how responsive or unresponsive, in most cases, wages and prices are. And that's where it comes into this stickiness concept that you hear macroeconomists talk about, or you hear again the talking heads on TV. They're talking about, the price level of this is, sticky, and it's going to take a long time. It'll eventually get there, but it's going to take, some time, and it's going to take a longer time horizon than we thought, because it's, they're not as flexible, and they're just not hardly as capable of moving, are not able to move as quickly as we'd like for them to move. And John Maynard Keynes, I think, is the one that said, when we're talking about the long run, I think, he basically says, and I think his quote was something along the lines, in the long run, we're all dead. And I think the rationale there is, the short run trials and tribulations, booms and busts, and, people can't wait forever. And that's why Keynes is saying, that in the long run, we're all going to be dead because we can't wait forever. And that is why this short run aggregate supply curve is important in trying to explain kind of these, shortages and surplus, and how the price level changes, and, how we get from one state of equilibrium in the long run. There is an impact to the economy. It moves with this short run aggregate supply curve, and then eventually it gets us back to a new equilibrium point, but it will eventually get us back to equilibrium. And then this is where, I don't know whether you want to even bring it up, because in the text, they start talking about, and we'll get into them a little later in this chapter, but they talk about the role of the policymakers. And, policymakers, as we'll discuss a little later, it's a conundrum for them. They, as we talked about, earlier in 5, 6, and 7, they're looking at metrics that they can get their arms around. What does GDP look like? What's the CPI look like? What's the rate of unemployment? Metrics that they can kind of reach out and touch and get their arms around. But when we're talking about developing policy, I mean, it is I won't say a crapshoot, but it is a risky proposition, especially when you're talking about shifts and impacts to the economy and how it impacts aggregate demand and aggregate supply. It's a risky business. It's not a business I'm not sure I'd particularly want to be in, because it is just, there are just so many unknowns. It makes it extremely risky. And so what happens is we try to explain some of these processes or some of these options to policymakers as you're looking at a short run aggregate supply. And, the shift in demand, and, while it may be a temporary shift, but there's a shift in demand. And so there's a shift in demand, and you've got your long run aggregate supply curve. It's vertical. That demand is shifting out. So the shift, here's your long run average supply demand. That demand is shifting out, and as it shifts out, you end up with shortages, and at least temporary shortages. And wages and prices, are sticky and slow to move, and output to meet the demand, it expands out past way beyond the potential. And so, you're talking about, what's going to happen to the omega, the nominal wage rate divided by the price level. What's going to happen to that when wages and prices are sticky? And, your short run aggregate supply, it holds constant. It holds constant your capital stock, because again, the short run, it holds constant natural resources, hold constant the level of technology, and it holds constant the prices of factors of production. Because again, we're in short run and things, because it's not just the wage rate that's sticky, it's prices that are sticky too. So it's holding these factors constant. And and if the shift in demand is in the other direction, you end up with a temporary surplus. So you've got the short run aggregate supply, and it's shifting up or down. And usually it's in response to a shift in demand, either, an increase or decrease in aggregate demand. So you're left with this, you're left with a situation where the markets are not equilibrium. And at that point, we're trying to figure out, not only when I say we, it's usually policymakers are trying to figure out what they can do to impact the short run average supply curve to get the economy back into equilibrium. And with that, I'm going to stop this portion of chapter 8, because I'm going to get into the next section. It'll be section 5, and I'm going to talk about, just the concept of stickiness when we're talking about wage stickiness, price stickiness, and how the concepts of stickiness and how they impact not only the aggregate demand curve, but the short run aggregate supply curve, and how it moves from the short run back to the long run and works around these issues of being stickiness. So that's all for right now. Get back to you, and hopefully in a few minutes, and we'll try to jump into the concept of stickiness. And it sounds a little foreign when you first start through it, but I think it'll be fairly clear as we go through it. Talk to you soon.